Welcome to the Burn Bag Podcast. My name is Andrew Gonawala, and today I talk to Casey Michel. He is the author of Foreign Agents: How American Lobbyists and Lawmakers Threaten Democracy Around the World. We talk a lot about the controversies in the current news cycle, including cases that have involved current US senators, retired US senators, think tank experts, and also an official in the New York governor's office, all of whom have been utilized by foreign influence operations targeting policy change in the United States. Take a listen to that and much more right now. My name is Andrew Gonawala. Welcome to the Burn Bag Podcast. A lot's been happening in the news lately. We saw an arrest with the New York governor's office. Apparently, a staffer there has been convicted of being a foreign agent for China. We've been seeing foreign agents being investigated who are affiliated with think tanks. We've seen the resignation of New Jersey Senator Bob Menendez, who was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. A lot of foreign influence all over the place in these centers of power. How do we make sense of this? Well, I'm happy to bring on Casey Michel. Casey is currently the director of the Combating Kleptocracy program at the Human Rights Foundation, as well as a writer, analyst, and investigative journalist working on topics ranging from kleptocracy, illicit finance, dark money, foreign lobbying, and foreign interference. His new book, Foreign Agents: How American Lobbyists and Lawmakers Threaten Democracy Around the World, is out now. He is also the author of American Kleptocracy: How the U.S. Created the World's Greatest Money Laundering Scheme in History. Casey, while this is probably bad news for the country, it's certainly a good time to write that book.
Yeah, thanks, Andre. Obviously, it's great to be here with you today. As I have told many folks, the silver lining for the state of the world, and certainly as it pertains to the influence growing every single day from these foreign influence and foreign lobbying networks, the silver lining is that, yes, it does make this work relevant. And who knows, maybe even we'll sell a few more copies of my new book, Foreign Agents, which is just out and available on bookshelves now.
I mean, certainly, I hope all of these developments aren't part of the PR tour, but I would love your reactions to the latest news about Linda Sun from Governor Hochul's office in New York. Casey, you're sitting in Brooklyn right now. What are your reactions to what just went on there? Because I feel like usually we hear about these cases at a federal level, at a national level, but this is happening at a state level now, too.
Yes, it is. That's look, for any number of these recent foreign lobbying charges, foreign lobbying crimes, some of which you have you just mentioned a moment ago, Andre. You know, the kind of the reaction that I have time and again is, you know, shocked but not surprised, or maybe surprised but not shocked. You know, whatever that phrase may be. But as it pertains to the Linda Sun case, and again, this was the top aide to the governor of the state of New York, not just some brand new, you know, staffer who just joined, but someone who was embedded in the highest ranks of the policymaking community in the state of New York, which again, at the end of the day, is one of the most important, certainly one of the most powerful American states there is. The fact that someone was able to gain access to that office and to the governor, and again, to do so at a state level rather than a federal level, which is really where all the investigations, all the attention is. I mean, it really is shocking. As far as I'm aware, and in conversations with other researchers, this is the very first time we have seen an indictment related to someone at the state level in a governor's office rather than in Washington at a think tank or in Congress or around the White House. This is the very first time in American history that we have seen something like this at the state level. And I suspect this is just a microcosm of what takes place in states across the country. Because again, Andre, a lot of what I work on, what I'm sure we'll be talking about today, is what is taking place at the federal level in terms of federal policymaking, American foreign policy, American trade policy, so on and so forth. But I certainly suspect much of this is also taking place at the state level, and not just in New York, but in Texas and California and around the country, that we are only going to continue learning about in the years to come.
I mean, according to some of the Associated Press reporting on this, apparently Linda Sun was influential in spoiling efforts by some representatives of Taiwan's government to meet with New York state officials. She also helped the governor record, I think, wishes for people for a happy Lunar New Year, which, I mean, I guess is something you need foreign influence for. And also, you know, just preventing the governor from actually talking about certain human rights abuses and so on. And in return, according to the Associated Press, she got tickets to performances by Chinese dance groups, Nanjing style salted ducks, and I think some of these other just like manial, like luxury items. I mean, some of this stuff is just ludicrous, to be honest.
No, it absolutely is. Again, the thing like the salted ducks, right? This is where truth becomes stranger than fiction
Yeah.
and makes these so bizarre that they're certainly memorable. But in addition to all of that, her husband was allegedly receiving millions of dollars in effectively cut out payments that allowed them to buy high-end automobiles, a high-end house on Long Island. According to the indictment, one of her friends actually asked her. She said, "Look, you're just a public official. Your husband doesn't seem to have any kind of successful business. Don't you think people are going to start asking questions about where you're getting all this money from?" And she just responded with one word. She just said mortgage, which, look, mortgages are very helpful, but they're not going to allow you to get multi-million-dollar homes if you don't actually have that money, which of course is where this alleged CCP influence campaign comes in, bankrolling her and her husband so that she can effectively control what the New York governor is doing or is not doing, who she's meeting with or is not meeting with, all for the benefit of Beijing.
It's crazy. Now, let's take a step back for our audience. What is a foreign agent? That's the title of your book. We often hear that term, but what do we define a foreign agent as?
Yeah, for the purposes of this book, the term foreign agent really just means a foreign lobbyist. This isn't necessarily a spy or someone engaged in espionage in the traditional sense. This is instead someone stemming from the lobbying sector in the United States of America, which is, of course, a multi-billion-dollar industry of Americans, American individuals, American figures, American firms. These are PR shops. These are consultancies and law firms. These are, of course, many former members of Congress or their staff or of the White House, all of whom have become lobbyists in and around, typically Washington, D.C., though, of course, not always just Washington, and using their connections, using their access, opening the doors of the Washington political establishment to their clients. Now, again, traditionally, that has been on the domestic side. But as I write about in this book about these foreign lobbyists, about these foreign agents, now we see this taking place for foreign clients as well. And most especially foreign regimes, foreign dictatorships, authoritarians, and autocrats that are paying millions of dollars, now it being also a multi-billion-dollar industry, to gain access to the highest ranks of the American political establishment in Washington.
So one thing I love about your book is that you really take us through the history of foreign lobbying. Can you sort of tell us about some of the earliest examples of foreign lobbying that impacted U.S. history?
Sure, absolutely. I think it's worth remembering, worth reminding listeners, Andre, and certainly worth reminding myself. This is something that I learned along the way, is that lobbying in the United States, for as sordid of an industry as it is now, this is a constitutionally protected right. It's right there in the First Amendment, along the freedoms of speech and religion and press. All Americans have the right to petition their government, their legislator, for a redress of grievances, which is just a fancy old-timey way of saying you or I or any other Americans can go to our legislators in the federal government, the state government, the city government, and lobby for whatever interest we want, whatever cause we think is worth lobbying on behalf of. And now this lobbying, in that sense, is as American as apple pie or baseball, or whatever you like. And it goes back to the earliest days of the American Republic, all the way back to the 1790s, when veterans of the Revolutionary War were lobbying the Washington administration of George Washington for back pay. But we also see early cases of what we now understand to be, we now describe as foreign lobbying. The one that comes to mind, the most spectacular scandal in terms of foreign lobbyists in the 19th century, was when in the 1860s, right after the American Civil War, the United States government is looking to patch the country back together. They're looking at expansion, territorial expansion, potentially as a way of doing that. But Americans are a little on the fence in terms of spending significant sums on new territory. All of a sudden, Alaska is for sale. And legislators in Washington, especially the Secretary of State, they see that as an opportunity, again, to bring the country together if only they can get the votes to actually do this. And this is where the Russian government steps in. And of course, we think about Russian interference, Russian influence. We think about the last 10 years or 2016. Turns out this goes all the way back to the middle of the 19th century. I don't want to spoil too many of the details, but there are allegations of bribery and vote flipping. There are journalists that are bought off. This goes again all the way into the White House with the Russian ambassador hiring former White House officials to do his dirty work. And again, millions of dollars end up missing as a result. And it all blows up into this massive scandal that is a foreign lobbying scandal. There's still, 150 years later, plenty of questions about where the money went or who was actually taking bribes. But this was the kind of playbook that we saw 150 years ago that is, in many ways, still with us. And it's one of these kind of through lines of American history that, of course, I had the opportunity to write about in the book, but which I found so absolutely fascinating.
And what we're referring to for our audience is Seward's Follies. William Seward, the Secretary of State back in the 1860s, bought Alaska, and we thought it was frankly useless land. So, I mean, that's a very interesting example. But I think, one person you profile in the book is this guy named Ivy Lee, who you refer to as the father of the modern PR industry. Can you tell us a bit more about Ivy?
Sure.
And some of his more interesting connections who are non-American.
Sure. Yeah. Look, it's not my descriptor of Lee. That it is how he is remembered. If anyone still knows about him, he is considered the father of the public relations industry, which is, of course, again, a multi-billion-dollar industry, which is massive. He was working and operating at the end of the 19th, early 20th century. At the time, there wasn't really a PR industry, and he had the kind of strategic vision to realize that public opinion was something that not only could be, but should be harnessed by both tycoons of the era as well as politicians of the era. And so again, he started building out everything we recognize of the PR industry. He invented the first press release. He created the first crisis management playbook. He ended up working with really the who's who in America at the time, with the Rockefellers, with Charles Schwab, with Woodrow Wilson. He really kind of became a celebrity unto himself as the kind of go-to guy. If anyone has an issue with their image or the reputation, he's the one to go see. And again, he was incredibly successful. But at a certain point, by the 1920s, 1930s, he realized there were more clients that he could go search for, not just in the United States, but abroad. And again, this is the aftermath of World War I. These are rising totalitarian regimes, many of which are looking to push policies in Washington, D.C. that will benefit them. Of course, these are thoroughly anti-democratic regimes. And what they all kind of seem to realize at the same time is that Ivy Lee can be their man in Washington. He can be their man as well in terms of managing PR and accessing policymakers in the federal government. And so, firstly, Ivy Lee shows up in Rome, where he has a sit-down meeting with Benito Mussolini, where they talk about this new governance model called fascism, which Lee certainly seems very excited about. And Lee, we know, was providing advice to Mussolini about how to launder his image, about how to create this image of a stable, successful, strong man that Americans should try to emulate. Lee then went to Moscow, to the opposite end of the ideological spectrum, to meet with the new Soviet regime that was then gaining power in Moscow. And he met with almost everyone in the Soviet regime, almost everyone except for Joseph Stalin. For reasons that are still unclear, Stalin actually didn't make it to their meeting. But again, there is Lee on the ground advising the Soviets how to craft their messaging, how to answer questions, and how to identify potentially sympathetic legislators and lawmakers in Washington to push pro-Soviet policy. And then in the early 1930s, Lee shows up most notoriously in Berlin, and he does all the exact same stuff for the new regime that is taking power in Germany, known as the Nazis. And he is meeting with Joseph Goebbels. He is meeting with Adolf Hitler. And again, providing all of this advice to them. How to navigate the halls of power in Washington. How to bring Americans into your camp to support you. How to play down concerns about anti-Semitism and Hitler's stormtroopers. How to say it's all just defensive. We're just supporting the German people. There's nothing to be worried about with the Nazis. This is what Ivy Lee was doing. This is how Ivy Lee was making the modern equivalent of millions and millions of dollars. And this is all what ended up leading to his career and his reputation imploding when Congress found out what he was doing.
So why? Like was he genuinely a fascist? Did he like truly believe in the cause, or I guess was he a communist? Did he truly believe in the cause? Did he have a thing for totalitarian dictators, or was he just in it for the money? Like, I mean, sure, you could be just in it for the money, but the money's got to be really good for you to support all of those guys.
Sure, I certainly think he was in it for the money. Again, he's making the modern equivalent of millions of dollars for, frankly, not a lot of work, right? It's kind of monitoring the media in the United States, providing talking points, taking some nice trips to Berlin every once in a while. It's not like he's working 18-hour days to try to do everything he can for the Nazis. My sense in reading through his papers, in going through his archive, and following the entire arc of his life is that he just had a thing for power. He had a thing for people in power. He had a thing for, in this case, totalitarians who had the most access, the strongest grip on those levers of power. That is what I sense he was attracted to. I think he had a massive ego, that he saw himself as this kind of geopolitical almost fixer, or someone who's a go-between for governments and for entire peoples. And he viewed himself as someone of kind of historic import, and which is why he crossed the ideological spectrum from the fascists to the communists, and of course made significant money along the way.
And you mentioned, I think, Charles Schwab as someone who utilized his talents, his intellect. Who were some other prominent Americans, either, I mean, business tycoons? Were there any presidents who utilized his knowledge?
Yeah, no, a few of the names I mentioned a moment ago, certainly on the political side, folks like Woodrow Wilson came to him for advice. I wouldn't be surprised if there were a number of other presidents, though I didn't see any necessarily names in the archives that came to him for advice, because again, by the 1910s, certainly by the 20s, and even into the 30s, he was very much a celebrity unto himself. He was very much a known quantity. There's not really someone in modern America that we can point to as the equivalent in the PR space. I mean, but he was just as well known as many of the political figures he worked with, and certainly many of the private sector individuals he worked with. Most especially folks
Yeah.
like the Rockefellers, both John Rockefeller Sr. and John D. Rockefeller Jr., both of whom came to him for reputation management. Most notoriously, there was a massacre of striking workers in Colorado that the Rockefellers were ultimately responsible for. It was a horrific crime. It was potentially the worst single day of violence in labor history in the United States history. And in swept Ivy Lee to talk about how it was actually the miners' fault and the Rockefellers shouldn't be blamed for this whatsoever. Oh, by the way, John Rockefeller Sr. is just a kindly old man. Oh, look at him. He gives dimes to children. Who could be opposed to that? He's just a nice guy. And it's really those miners' fault. Oh, by the way, they're immigrants, and oh, we don't necessarily trust them anyway. This whole kind of playbook, this rigmarole of putting all the blame on those striking workers rather than his corporate clients in the Rockefeller family.
So now someone else you profile in the book who more of our general audience members may recognize in a modern political context is Paul Manafort, the Trump associate who's been indicted, I think is in prison right now. What's his deal? Why was he unique among the cases?
Yeah, Manafort was fascinating from an intellectual perspective for a few reasons. He's very similar to Ivy Lee. The kind of the arc of his career is very similar, but also the kind of strategic vision that he had in the modern era is very similar to what Ivy Lee had about a century ago. So Manafort is born, 1940s, 1950s, kind of mid-century America, and he's growing up. He becomes a Republican. He's a pretty conservative guy. But in the 1970s and in the 1980s, he makes a name for himself really as a political consultant, helping launch especially Republicans to power in Washington. And what he and a few of his colleagues realize is that not only is that a successful model unto itself, but they don't actually have to stop there. They don't have to focus on just getting people in power. Once they have those people in power in Congress, maybe even in the White House itself, they can then go to clients in the private sector and say, look, we would love to represent you in Washington. And we would love to do so because we are extremely well connected. We can open the doors directly to these members of the House, these members of the Senate, or again, of course, potentially the White House itself. We could be your foot soldiers in Washington. We could be your go-to voices in Washington and open these doors that had previously been closed to you. And it turned out that was an extremely lucrative business model. They made millions of dollars. They became absolute power players in Washington. And then, oh, by the way, they also mentioned to their former clients in Congress that if those clients are running for re-election in the House or in the Senate, wouldn't it be nice if they had someone who could connect them to the private sector for campaign donations? So you have this kind of closed loop, closed circle where you're taking with one hand and giving to the other, and then taking with that and then giving with the other one. And it was really this kind of vision that Manafort was able to lay out and then bring into being that created, as one of the researchers in the book that I cite says, really kind of created the swamp as we know it. This kind of glad handing, the kind of, again, closed loop that has been with us for decades, but didn't really exist until Paul Manafort came onto the scene. And then, like Ivy Lee, Paul Manafort realized he doesn't have to have clients just in the United States. There is a whole world of clients who are just waiting for him abroad. And again, this is 1980s and especially the 1990s. The Cold War is over. Economies are opening up. Regime after regime, government after government are looking for ways to access policymakers in Washington. And here comes Paul Manafort. And the next thing you know, all of a sudden, this foreign lobbying industry, as we understand it, is being created in real time by Manafort, by his colleagues. He ends up working for dictator after dictator in places like Nigeria, places like Somalia, places like Angola, places like the Philippines, even through the early 2010s, most notoriously in places like Ukraine, where he was trying to cement in power a budding autocrat, a pro-Kremlin thug named Viktor Yanukovych, who you and listeners may remember was tossed out of power in 2014 after Ukraine's democratic revolution. But Manafort really kind of births the foreign lobbying industry as we understand it, as we know it. He has this very clear innovative streak for, frankly, all the worst reasons. But of course, he made significant money along the way.
So you mentioned the swamp and how Manafort sort of created this swamp to an extent. And the guy who hired Paul Manafort has his slogan's been drain the swamp, Donald Trump, of course. But another guy who hired Paul Manafort back in 1996, Bob Dole, former longtime GOP senator, presidential opponent of Bill Clinton in 1996, just passed away fairly recently. You talk about Bob Dole in the book as one of the first, I think, senior level politicians who really made a name for themselves with a foreign lobbying career. Can you tell us a little bit more about Bob Dole?
Yeah, Bob Dole, his nickname is the Lion of the Senate. He's an American military veteran. He is a long-standing senator from the great state of Kansas, and of course runs for president in 1996, ends up losing to Bill Clinton. But he still has this image in Washington, even to this day, of this kind of kind of older image of what bipartisanship looked like in Washington. Maybe folks had political disagreements, but at the end of the day, they could all come together as patriotic Americans. And I suppose to an extent that's fine and that's true. But there's an irony in that Bob Dole, as you just mentioned, Andre, was the very first really senior level statesman, first prominent former American official who he retired in the late 1990s, early 2000s, who didn't just kind of go off into the sunset, go retire, go write his memoirs. He realized that he could also make millions of dollars or significant sums by becoming almost immediately a foreign lobbyist, quite literally a foreign agent. You can still go to the Department of Justice website and look at his registration as a foreign agent, which is, again, this kind of irony that he's still viewed as this great patriot. But it turns out he was selling out to the highest bidders he could find abroad. Now, some of these were democratic governments, these like places like Taiwan, places like Kosovo, but not all of them. He was working in the Democratic Republic of Congo to try to entrench an authoritarian regime there. He ended up working as the go-to guy for one of the most, if not the most notorious Russian oligarchs, a guy named Oleg Deripaska, who's extremely close to Vladimir Putin. He's now sanctioned by the Americans, sanctioned by the Europeans. Bob Dole was his mouthpiece. Bob Dole was his go-to guy to try to get Deripaska a visa in the United States so Deripaska could come to the United States and build out all these pro-Kremlin networks and investments in the U.S. This is what Bob Dole was doing. And I think the really, I suppose, nefarious part of this is that if someone like Bob Dole, who again has this stellar reputation, could do it, that was a whole permission structure that he was giving to former members of Congress across the board that, look, it can't be so wrong. If someone like Bob Dole is doing it, why shouldn't I be doing it as well?
Morally frustrating. But lobbying is not illegal. But is this type of lobbying illegal?
No, it's not. Part of that is for the reasons we talked about earlier, the constitutional protections. Part of it, though, is also if we go back to the days of Ivy Lee, we didn't talk about how he was eventually found out
Uh-huh.
by investigators in Congress. He was brought before Congress in 1934. They were trying to figure out how exactly the Nazis and the fascists in Italy and even the Soviets were targeting Americans. And they knew Ivy Lee had something to do with the Germans, but they weren't quite sure. And so they brought him in for questioning. It was so funny reading through the transcript because it begins very cordially. Um, they all kind of know one another. Again, everyone knows who Ivy Lee is. But reading through the transcript, you can see the legislators getting more and more frustrated by Lee kind of ducking and dodging the questions, saying, oh, he didn't have a contract with Hitler, but he actually had a contract with a private company, but oh, it was never written down. And also, maybe what I was doing was giving them advice about how to target Americans, but maybe I wasn't. He's being very slippery, and you can see the legislators getting more and more and more frustrated. And anyways, the spoiler for that is they eventually realize that he's been doing exactly what you and I have been talking about, is advising the Nazis on how to target Americans. And as a result, it blows up into this massive scandal, right? Massive headlines in the New York Times, so on and so on. And legislators, as a result, passed something called the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which is where the book gets its name from. And that act, again, it doesn't make any of this illegal. It just requires that these foreign lobbyists disclose what they're doing, who they're working for, and how much money they're making, what they're doing with that money, what they're publishing along the way, all these kind of different things that they're doing on behalf of their foreign clients. They just have to disclose what they're doing. They have to tell the Department of Justice, which will then publicize it and publish it for the American populace. And that's all that foreign lobbyists have to do. Again, none of this is illegal. They just have to reveal, they just have to share and disclose what they're actually doing.
Well, I think someone who I think really makes the legacy of Bob Dole, I think, proud perhaps, is Senator Bob Menendez, former chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, just convicted on taking bribes in gold and cash while acting as a foreign agent of Egypt. And again, folks, in case you think we're just going after Republicans on this session, no, we're going after Democrats too. Bob Menendez, what was going on? I mean, this is a guy who is supremely influential in foreign policy spaces, spheres, especially in the legislature, as the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
Yeah, I think the most important things up top. Bob Menendez was convicted just a few weeks ago of being the very first American legislator in American history, the very first member of Congress in American history conspiring to act as a foreign agent. This is the first time in almost 250 years that we have seen this in the United States of America. He was working on behalf, not of his constituents in New Jersey, but the military dictatorship in Egypt. He was passing them highly sensitive information. He was secretly lobbying his colleagues on behalf of them. He was drafting talking points and letters for his handlers in Cairo. And again, he's not just some freshman senator. He's not just some new no-name legislator that they targeted. He was the chairperson. He was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which is the single most powerful position in the American Senate, in the American Congress, in terms of charting a path and making decisions related to American foreign policy. If you are a foreign regime, if you are a foreign government, and you want to flip anyone in the American Congress, that is the person you go to. That is the most important person you can target, and that is what the Egyptians did, and that is what the Egyptian government did successfully. So all of that out of the way, That's all the context for Bob. Some of the details of this were, of course, as with many of these cases, absolutely hilarious. So, take, for instance, what he was receiving. There were a number of gold bars that he accepted as payment, as effective bribery from some of these middlemen that were working on behalf of the Egyptian government. I think the best part of that was not just that he defended himself by saying, oh, he's a his family, he comes from a family of Cuban refugees, and this is just what we do. We hide gold bars under our bed because we never know when we're going to need them. But I think the funniest part for me was after he received them is he went on Google and he Googled how much is a gold bar worth, which again, you can't make these facts up. Um, but it was a staggering series of allegations. It was a remarkable conviction, a very successful prosecution from the Department of Justice. And for the very first time in American history, we saw something like that. And I should say, you mentioned a moment ago, Andre, we're not just going after Republicans, and of course not. This is absolutely a bipartisan issue. And I think it's also worth highlighting that there is another ongoing indictment, an ongoing case in the American Congress against another Democrat, a member of the House of Representatives named Henry Cuellar, who is accused of being a foreign agent working on behalf of the government of Azerbaijan. That case is slated to go to trial early next year. Certainly, I'll be following it very closely. But again, he's another Democrat, and certainly, based on the evidence we have seen thus far, absolutely guilty. We'll see what happens in that trial.
What was he doing? What position, I guess, was he trying to advance?
Well, he was pushing for pro-Azerbaijan policies in Washington, and Andre, as you may remember, Azerbaijan has a few different stories and a few different networks that are detailed in the book. And me personally, I very much have the Azerbaijan dictatorship to thank for getting me initially interested in this. But he was, again, I think it was, just pushing for military aid, for economic aid in Congress for Azerbaijan. He wasn't accepting gold bars, but his wife was accepting what they described as consulting fees through a series of sham companies and shell corporations that were actually being bankrolled directly by the government in Azerbaijan. And one fun detail on that is that the woman, the very first foreign lobbyist I ever interacted with was representing Azerbaijan. Of course, I didn't know it at the time, but she invited me over to Azerbaijan on an all expenses paid junket, pay for my flights, pay for my hotels, pay for everything. But as she said, the only thing they ask is that I don't write anything negative about the government in Azerbaijan, which of course I couldn't agree to. But just a few weeks ago, or maybe a few months ago now, she pleaded guilty in this case out of the House of Representatives for being an unregistered foreign lobbyist. So it's yes, how things come around.
Gee. And what I sort of wonder with this Menendez case specifically, very powerful guy, very influential. I'm sure even if you're a young person, you want to get into foreign policy on the Hill, probably had to go through that guy or like some gates and doors affiliated with Bob Menendez. I feel like this town, DC, people gossip a lot, people yip and yap, people talk. Would this thing have necessarily been unknown per se that this guy is taking bribes, gold bars? Like, would there have been like hints?
I don't know. Certainly, of course I'm based in New York, not in DC. I never got any indication one way or the other, but I suspect that maybe aside from the gold bars, at least, I do suspect that this kind of behavior is far more common, far more routine than I think a lot of folks in Washington would ever like to admit, whether they're on the legislative side, whether they're staffers, whether they're think tankers, you name it. This kind of pay to play access, of course, takes place rampantly on the domestic side. But what we have seen, even in just the past few weeks with all these other indictments that have come out, absolutely takes place in the foreign lobbying sector itself. And of course, as the book details, these foreign lobbying regulations were effectively ignored for decades. And it's really not until very recently, especially after 2016, that folks paid any attention to this, cared any one way about this. And it's really, frankly, not even until the last few months that we've seen serious prosecutions go after not just networks affiliated with Manafort or Russia, but across the board, Egypt, Azerbaijan, China, South Korea, you name it. that we're only finally, getting a good look at how some of these networks operate. I suspect this behavior is far, far, far more common in Washington than I think anyone would like to admit.
So another case that I've been sort of following very closely because this also involves a former podcast guest, Sumi Terry. We had her on the podcast back in like 2020 or 2021 when I thought that she was the Korea expert and she was very much billed and framed as the Korea expert, being part of the Council on Foreign Relations and so on. But she was just, I think, indicted for taking, I think, a lot of like nice luxury items from the South Korean government, having a South Korean handler, and basically writing South Korean talking points, trying to advance their position, even leaking an off the records meeting she had with Secretary of State Antony Blinken to her South Korean handlers. What was going on with her case?
Yeah, this was again one of the more recent cases that we have seen. Of course, she's innocent until proven guilty. As you said, Andre, she was kind of the go-to person in Washington for all things Korea, both North Korea and South Korea. I never had the opportunity to interact with her, but of course she has all the credentials, Council on Foreign Relations, writing for Foreign Affairs, so on and so on, and very much a part of the kind of think tank and policymaking nexus that we see in Washington. The case again, it's foreign lobbying related. It's that she didn't register any of her work with the Foreign Agents Registration Act, even though she knew that she should and that she knew what that entailed. I think I'll just read through some of the allegations
Yeah.
that are in the indictment, which are again spectacular, but I suspect far more common than we have seen elsewhere. Among the things that she is accused of is accepting funding from South Korea to write articles either praising South Korea or pushing South Korean talking points, which may not in and of itself be necessarily illegal, but is of course insanely unethical to not disclose that to your editors or to your readers. And that took place in Foreign Affairs in and of itself. She was accepting multiple luxury goods. I don't remember what brands they were, Dolce & Gabbana or Coach, maybe. Those are beyond my pay grade, but luxury bags and luxury coats from a person she knew to be a South Korean intelligence officer, which again seems like a big no-no if you want to maintain some kind of basic ethics along the way. She's having off-the-record meetings with the top American diplomat, Antony Blinken, in the Secretary of State's office. Again, off the record, you're not supposed to be sharing that with anyone. And then immediately getting into a car with her South Korean handler and letting him take photos of all of her notes from that meeting. I don't know if that counts as treason. I don't know necessarily where the legal lines on that may be, but certainly absolutely unethical in and of itself. And then, of course, she was also hiding South Korean funding to her own think tank, which I believe was the Wilson Center, hiding it from her colleagues and hiding it from those that are attending events that she was organizing, and using financial secrecy to mask where the funds were actually coming from. So again, any one of these things might be extremely frowned upon, maybe not necessarily illegal, but you look at all of these taken together and it is as clear as day that she not only knew what she was doing, but was hiding all of this from absolutely everyone that she could.
I mean, of course, it's always innocent until proven guilty, but geez, oh geez, this case is pretty bad. It's pretty bad,
It is. It is. I will say for those that follow this on the kind of legal architecture of foreign lobbying, it appears to be the weakest legal case in terms of possible evidence that would lead to a guilty decision. Again, for things like foreign lobbying, you can't issue civil fines. There is no civil penalty. You have to pass the criminal threshold. So they have to prove not only that she was acting as a foreign lobbyist, but that she was doing it willfully, that she was willfully ignoring foreign lobbying regulations. It's not, again, as spectacular as hiding gold bars like Bob Menendez or necessarily setting up fake shell companies to hide funding like the Henry Cuellar Azerbaijan case. But certainly at the end of the day, she is no victim whatsoever. I mean, she was hiding these things from her editors, from her colleagues, and of course from folks like Antony Blinken, who thought he was having an off-the-record conversation and had no idea she's going directly to her South Korean handler.
So is it legally weak? Because I guess a lot of the things she was getting, the gifts, were like these informal items, like handbags, maybe like a nice dinner here or there, etc.
Yeah, it's that. It's also the kind of scope and the scale. So if we're talking about Again, to go back to the New York case, the woman who's involved in that, Linda Sun, I don't remember the total, but there were millions of dollars involved in the alleged payments that she's accused of accepting on behalf of working for the Chinese government. Whereas with the Sumi Terry case, I think it's at the max tens of thousands of dollars, in addition, of course, to the luxury goods, luxury handbags. So you have a kind of a scope and a scale discrepancy there. But again, at the end of the day, if the Department of Justice is bringing this case forward, they feel like they have the goods, and they are going to try to prove that in the court of law.
So DC think tanks, I mean, they're seen as the prestigious scions of foreign policy knowledge in this city. You know, as a college student and as a grad student, everyone who's anyone in foreign policy always wants to intern there. I interned at two of them. Uh, how does foreign influence peddling occur at DC think tanks? Another former guest of ours, General John Allen, former president of the Brookings Institution, had to resign following allegations that he had not registered as a foreign agent of the Qatari government, for example. I mean, I mean, I'm just, when you take a step back, you know, it's super interesting to hear what's going on behind the scenes. But I mean, the think tanks, what's your take on that?
No, I look, that's a great question. And I look, I've worked with think tanks in the past. I think certainly some of them
Yeah.
do fantastic work. And of course, they play a key role in the policymaking community in Washington. Many of them are staffed by former members of Congress or former members of the military. Many of them provide staffing for incoming White House administrations. They're very much a brain trust in terms of American foreign policy making. At the same time, they are also incredibly fertile targets for foreign regimes, foreign governments seeking to access and influence American foreign policymaking. And one of, if not the key reasons for that, is because for as long as think tanks have been around, and you can even go back 100 years ago for the founding of the Brookings Institution, foreign think tanks have never been considered, legally or otherwise, part of the foreign lobbying world. They have never been subject to foreign lobbying requirements. They have never had to disclose any foreign payments that they receive or what they may or may not be doing on behalf of the foreign governments that they are taking millions and millions of dollars from. And again, these aren't just democratic allies, places like Canada or the UK or Australia or even South Korea or Japan that we're talking about. These are authoritarian regimes. These are dictatorships abroad, places like the United Arab Emirates, places like Qatar, places like Azerbaijan, places like Kazakhstan, giving millions of dollars to America's most nominally prestigious think tanks. And again, this is not an ideological thing. It's not a right-left focus of this. It is across the board. You can look at the Heritage Foundation's relations out of Hungary. You can look at the Center of American Progress, which is where I used to work, accepting millions of dollars from the United Arab Emirates. Or you can look smack in the middle with groups like the Atlantic Council or Brookings Institution, taking significant sums from either the Emiratis or with Brookings, the Qataris. And then, of course, that going all the way up the chain to the president of Brookings being forced to resign because of investigations into his own financial shenanigans with the Qataris. I should say that that investigation was eventually dropped. He was never found guilty on any charges. But the things that were revealed about what he was doing were, again, incredibly unethical. I think I had an article about what he was accused of doing, and one of those was pushing the use of quote unquote black information operations, which are, again, extremely covert, sometimes illegal, information operations against those who are opposed to Qatar. Right? This is supposed to be an American military officer, as patriotic and blue-blooded as they come, selling out to a foreign dictatorship, just one of many that we know about, and doing so to this day.
It's crazy. And again, think tanks do a lot of great work. You know, I had a lot of great experiences when I worked there, but I mean, some of this stuff, I mean, it's just like problematic.
Andre, where did you work?
I was at Brookings in the Council on Foreign Relations.
Yeah. Brookings, yes. They sent me a statement not long ago that they no longer accept funds from Qatar, which is good. And again, that's more than most
Yeah.
think tanks have done. But of course, they had to get to that point first. And the Council on Foreign Relations, I don't think I wrote about them in this book, but I did write about them in my first book. They had one Russian oligarch who is now sanctioned. They had him on their board for years and years after the initial invasion of Ukraine in 2014. And when were you an intern there, Andre? Or were you an intern?
2020 intern, yeah.
Now, were you one of the Blavatnik
Oh
interns?
God. No, no. I was on US foreign policy.
Okay, I was going to say, because that was another post-Soviet oligarch that they have taken millions of dollars from to launch this internship program there now. And who doesn't want their interns funded at the end of the day?
Well, at least my resume isn't scarred yet.
No, but give it time. And again, this is the major reason is because think tanks have not had any requirements to disclose. Of course, they're not breaking any laws, but there have been no requirements for them to disclose any of that. Now, there are bills in Congress that propose a potential change like that. We'll see how that goes moving forward. But it has been a field day for foreign governments finding, again, open arms of think tanks in and around Washington.
That's crazy. And, beyond think tanks now, I sort of want to touch on the media sort of sphere. I think last week, actually, we saw the news about the Russian funneling of funds in a Tenet media, home to several very prominent conservative commentators who aren't really, on like Fox News or anything, but who have audiences of millions and millions of people who very strongly and staunchly support their side of the aisle, sometimes in very problematic ways, but who go viral time and time again. What are your reactions to that news?
Again, shocked but not surprised. Certainly not surprised that the Russians, the Russian government and their intermediaries at the propaganda outlet RT found again open arms among these so-called conservative influencers who are very prominent on in the podcasting space or on YouTube. I am a little bit shocked, not only that they didn't do even basic due diligence about where the money was coming from, but that this all took place within the last year, within the last 18 months, right? We're not even talking about after 2014 and the initial invasion. We're talking about after February 2022, when the Russians have launched the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It is just remarkable to me how little diligence any of these figures did about where these millions of dollars were coming from. And of course, now they're painting themselves as supposed victims of this, which does not pass the smell test whatsoever. But I think it is, again, a testament to how fertile of a field these regimes can find, especially among those in the media space or the podcasting space that are willing to push talking points that maybe they believe in ideologically, maybe not, but are willing to do so without asking even the bare bones question about where that money is coming from. And again, I suspect this is a far bigger issue than just what we have seen with that one indictment.
And it's something, that I'm taking away from this conversation is it's not necessarily American adversaries, right? It's not necessarily just Russia, but it's also like South Korea. For example, with the Sue Mi Terry case, South Korea is trying to, advance these ideas. Egypt's not necessarily, I'm not. We give a ton of military aid to Egypt, and they're, pushing this with the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So it really runs the gamut. I mean, Casey, are there any very prominent culprits of this in terms of countries, or is it just span the spectrum?
Well, it certainly spans the spectrum, but Andre, I think that's a great point that these networks don't have to be adversarial. They don't even necessarily have to be malign. At the end of the day, American and South Korean interests are very closely aligned. And I suspect that, and again, Sue Mi Terry is innocent until proven guilty, but I suspect that she or those in her orbit thought that even if this information came out, why would the American government ever prosecute someone who's just trying to deepen U.S.-South Korean relations? But of course, we also see this with other allies, with the Egyptians, who are a very close American partner, with Azerbaijan, a very close American partner. I mentioned Hungary a moment ago. I didn't do any work on Hungary in this book, but I've done work on Hungary since. They're a literal American ally, a NATO ally, and they have seeded these influence networks across Washington, especially on the conservative end of the spectrum. And even countries like Turkey, which is again an American ally, a NATO ally, has been doing so in Washington for years. And allegedly here in New York City as well, where our current mayor and his staff are under investigation for campaign finance violations for taking secret Turkish money, and the Turkish government, in response, receiving, among other things, the fast-tracked opening of the biggest Turkish consulate in the entire world. So, again, to circle back to the beginning of the conversation, not just in Washington, but even here in places like New York City, where these networks are absolutely operating.
So how can you actually like ensure accountability when so much of this feels just absolutely ingrained, in this country's political culture, in DC's political culture? I mean, we mentioned a bunch of institutions, organizations that have been privy, to some of these benefits from this foreign lobbying, organizations that I've had affiliations with, organizations that you've had affiliations with, organizations that many young foreign policymakers want to work at least get through the doors of if they want to have a career. How do you make sure that there can actually be accountability when so many of these ill-advised practices, for the lack of a more undiplomatic term, uh, feel so commonplace and occur with places and people that are so influential?
Well, look, I think it's a great question. I think Department of Justice has taken the lead, thankfully, on this finally, because these prosecutions are going to send a signal to other similar networks elsewhere that they could potentially be targeted, they could potentially be exposed. And it is high time for them, again, to disclose what they are actually doing and what money they are taking and who they're operating on behalf of. That's on the foreign lobbying side. On things like the think tank side, certainly I think it's worth supporting bills and the legislators who propose the bills that would require think tanks to actually disclose the funding that they are taking. And again, not making any of this necessarily illegal, but bringing transparency to this sector. And of course, this also applies to those that are working at these think tanks, working at places like the Atlantic Council, working at places, Center for American Progress, you name it, to advocate internally for more disclosures of the funding they are accepting from at least foreign governments, or maybe at the bare minimum, foreign dictatorships, those that aren't actually treaty allies of the United States of America, those that aren't necessarily even democracies. Those are just some of the things that we can do, that can be done. And I will say, Andre, if you and I have been having this conversation a year ago, I would have been a lot more pessimistic about where things are. And I have been accused of being too optimistic in the past, but I'll own it, because these prosecutions that we have seen, and of course they have to actually be proven guilty, so on and so on, that we have seen in the last few weeks have been truly like breathtaking. I mean, I couldn't have asked for better timing for the book to come out, but they have been remarkable to see DOJ finally setting its sights on these networks. And of course, there are plenty more that they could also set their sights on and investigate and potentially prosecute. But the fact that they are devoting resources to this is a very good sign, and I do hope will spark momentum elsewhere.
Well, on that note, for our audience, Casey's new book, Foreign Agents: How American Lobbyists and Lawmakers Threaten Democracy Around the World, is out now. We'll have a link to that on this podcast description. But Casey, this was a very insightful, fun conversation to have about something that seems to percolate so many aspects of, our professional lives in many ways. But
Yes,
hopefully
yes.
not ours personally on an individual.
No, that's the hope, being ever diligent, but of course being aware that these networks are operating, and how they operate and who they're targeting is a necessary first step to finally doing something about it. So, Andre, I appreciate the time, the interest, and obviously this conversation as well. I had a great time. So thank you so much.
Thank you.